Okay, it looks like we're at 1 o'clock Eastern, so we'll get things started here. First of all, I want to thank everyone for joining us today. The title of our webinar is U.S. Infrastructure Bill, Evaluating Risks versus Rewards. Beware, it's not all that it's cracked up to be. My name is Matt Murphy. I am the Vice President of IBISWorld's Commercial Banking Division. That being said, a lot of what we talk about here today will be applicable not just to IBISWorld's commercial banking clients, but folks in a lot of other verticals as well, whether that be investment firms, construction companies, manufacturers. So whether you're working in those industries or have customers that work in those industries, there will be a lot of good information about this new bill as well as the conflict over in Ukraine. I'm joined today by a couple people here from IBISWorld, as well as a guest that we have. Firstly, we have Rick Buczynski, who is IBISWorld's chief economist. We also have Robert Miles, who is our senior strategic market research analyst, who's helped put some of today's content together. And then we're also joined by Dev Strychek, who is a principal over at Devon Risk Advisory Group and formerly worked over at SunTrust Bank. So I'll kick things over to Rick in just a second here, but before we get started, we're not going to take questions live today. However, we do want to encourage folks to put any questions that they have into the chat box so that we can answer them after the fact. We've just got a few different people and we're covering a few different topics, so I want to make sure that we get the best answers to the right people depending on what the question is. So do want to say any questions that pop up along the way, make sure to drop them in the chat box. And like I said, we'll be sure to follow up with an email response after the webinar. We'll also have a couple things being sent out after the webinar itself. One is going to be a link to an article that is part of this webinar, part and parcel of the webinar. So an in-depth white paper that Rick and some of the other folks here published regarding the U.S. infrastructure bill. And then you also have a spreadsheet tool that is going to be talked about shortly here that will provide access to as well as a follow-up. Okay, so why did we choose the new infrastructure bill as a topic for a webinar as well as a white paper? The reason for that is that we've actually gotten a lot of questions from manufacturers that we work with, from banks that we work with that lend to manufacturers, into construction companies and businesses that invest in those industries as well. The bill itself sets aside a lot of money, $1.2 trillion to be earmarked in new investments starting in January over the next 5 years. And a lot of the questions we got were regarding, opportunities that our clients could take advantage of. We know that there are certain sectors and industries that stand to benefit a lot from this windfall of spending that is going to happen. So we want to help our clients, spend their time and their energy in the right places with the right industries. But we also understand that there's, potentially some hidden risks within this bill and some things that maybe aren't being talked about in the news as much as they should be, and things that we want our clients to be aware of. So we'll definitely be covering some of that as well. So aside from just pinpointing some specific industries and sectors that we think are going to be benefiting from the new infrastructure bill, we'll also talk a little bit about the conflict over in Ukraine. Obviously, that's something that's likely to be top of mind for a lot of people, given what's been happening in the marketplace with oil prices and a number of other factors. So I want to make sure we touch on that, as well as show off that new tool where we can help some of our customers, understand through plug and play just what industries they maybe want to look a little closer at, which industries are going to be positively or negatively impacted by certain macroeconomic factors impacted by the infrastructure bill or by the Ukraine conflict. We're going to talk a lot about construction in particular, as we know that that's one area that can be benefited, but not just construction in a vacuum, but also some of the supply chain issues that might impact those construction contractors. One thing that we're going to try to avoid today is, prognosticating too much about what's expected to happen in Ukraine. We really want to just keep focused on, the macroeconomic trends, the industries that we know are going to be affected the most. So we'll try to answer as much as we can through this, but we certainly are not going to pretend to have a crystal ball when it comes to global conflict. Before I kick things over to Rick, just want to say thank you to a couple other folks that helped us to publish this piece and put together this webinar. That's Kent Kirby from DICOM Software, as well as Chris Nichols from South State Bank. In fact, Chris has a blog post that he put up not too long ago that we do want to share after this webinar, so be on the lookout for that. We also have a link that we're going to provide to the National Association of Counties that has a lot of very localized information that we use to publish this piece, so do stay tuned for that. But without further ado, I'll hand things over to Rick.
Thanks so much, Matt. To kick things off, it's probably useful to walk through a basic schematic on how we approach the issue of identifying the opportunities and risks of the infrastructure legislation. So check out this chart. This underlies both the core research in our report as well as the tools that we have developed. The initial step was to identify the core industries of the bill. So we started by defining critical sectors associated with the Act. As you'll see in the next slide, we investigated 8 groups in total. In turn, we identified the specific industries in each group. In other words, we got more granular, more specific. The second step was to identify the supplier or so-called feeder industries in all 8 of these groups. We employed some of IBISWorld's mapping systems and our concentration risk tools in this effort. And then next, we used some of the research that we employed in last September's bottleneck supply chain risk study. And we did this to analyze risk for each infrastructure industry. And then we linked everything to NAICS, as we often do for our clients, particularly those involved in banking and in finance. And finally, we generated summary risk tables that I'll show in a minute, and we engineered an infrastructure investigation tool that Rob Miles will soon present. Here are the 8 key industry groups we analyzed. By the way, our focus was on physical infrastructure, building stuff, rebuilding stuff. First, we have roads and bridges. This is perhaps the most significant for our clients, so take a close look. Next are railroads, primarily an Amtrak allotment. So we're talking passenger traffic here. For example, the I-95 corridor, where I live and commute. Then we have the electric grid. This is a big time spend. So check out the links in our report. It's a major area with a lot of interesting nuances. Then we have the so-called water spend. It's a huge area where lead pipe replacement accounts for about $15 billion of the total. The broadband infrastructure spend is very localized. Much of this comes in the form of household subsidies to rural areas, so you'll have to do your homework here. As for ports and airports, $15 billion has been allotted for airport-related projects, where $17 billion allotted for ports and inland waterways. You'll need to check out the details. Some spending is earmarked for systems, other for physical construction. So you'll have to disentangle some of this. Then there's public transit. This is complicated and convoluted. You'll need to take a very micro approach in this case. And finally, the environment. There's a hodgepodge of sectors that are beneficiaries. Some involve grants, others involve subsidies. These will be earmarked to clean up hazardous waste sites, abandoned mines, and oil and gas wells that are not operational. So next we identified key supplier or feeder industries for all 8 of the groups that I just described. Here's an example. The example I took is for roads and bridges. So we have 2 core industries on the left-hand column, being road and highway construction, and also bridge and elevated highway construction. On the far right column, we've got the supplier industries for these 2. These range from manufacturing to mining industries to service industries like architects and engineering services. And also you can note in that far left-hand column that we've mapped to NAICS codes. And here's an interesting step in the process where we incorporated 4 key risk factors, or you might call them industry vulnerabilities. We borrowed this from our September 2021 report and webinar, Potential Bottlenecks to Recovery, the Supply Chain Riddle, and Credit Risk. The details of these 4 metrics are available in that report and also summarized in our infrastructure paper. Goodness, we've been reading a lot about these four factors the past 2 to 3 years at least. Labor shortages, supply chain disruptions, overseas trade exposures given trade conflicts, and of course, volatility. What we basically did is we built an index using the methodology from IBISWorld's industry early warning system, which some of you may be familiar with. And then we flagged these areas that were most vulnerable. So here are the results for the core infrastructure bill industries. This table is in the report, but it can also be provided as an Excel workbook. You can see how this simple spreadsheet is designed. The third column from the left is the infrastructure category. Those are the 8 categories that I had mentioned. Then in that fourth column is the industry description for all the industries that are within those categories. There are actually 27 of these industries that we identified. The first 2 columns, we have just mapping codes between IBISWorld and NAICS 2017. And then we have on the far 4 right columns the 4 risk factors that I discussed. If you want to look, for example, at train, subway, and transit car manufacturing under the category of railroads, I actually highlighted this for you. You can see that 3 of the categories have been flagged as being vulnerable. So here's the final major table in the report, also available as an Excel spreadsheet. It lists the results for all feeder supplier industries that we covered in this study. It's very similar to the format we had in the previous table. It has more than 50 industries, so it's too large to show here. Just check out the report and the spreadsheet. You can see I highlighted iron ore manufacturing, where we flagged 3 of 4 risk categories. Go check this table out. I think you'll find it useful. Let's not forget there are other more qualitative risks associated with the implementation of the infrastructure bill. These can't be overlooked when weighing potential risks and rewards. So here we go. There are always politics to consider. It's the world that we live in. But the likelihood of political risks probably has little to do with national politics in the upcoming midterm elections. The bill is bipartisan, right? We think the risks have to do with state and local political tug-of-wars determining ultimately who wins contracts. If you're serious about chasing business triggered by the bill, you obviously have to get into the weeds. And what about state and local economic risks? Well, these are woven together with state and local political risks. For IBISWorld clients, we suggest you consult our state and county level analysis available on our website. Again, another cliche, the devil is in the details. Geopolitical risks are always difficult to analyze. Russia's invasion of the Ukraine is a stark reminder on how the world has become deeply interconnected. These geopolitical forces can impact economic performance, potentially undermining the goals of the Infrastructure Act, particularly by intensifying the risk factors we already discussed, disrupting supply chains and international trade and fueling further volatility. External forces can also aggravate inflation, which we are already struggling with. The bottom line is that higher inflation can erode the real purchasing power of the infrastructure plan. And obviously intertwined with inflation are surging commodity prices, as I'm sure Dev Strychek will consider when he discusses construction contractors. Higher costs of materials such as lumber, cement, steel, and copper, to name a few, are possible headwinds to the infrastructure plan, as is the increasing unpredictability of their prices. Finally, the pandemic remains a wild card. Every time experts claim that we are pulling out of the woods, another variant or outbreak emerges. 2 steps forward, 1 step back. One additional comment regarding risks. As one of the co-authors of our report, Ken Kirby, observed, It's not really the traditional risk of default that's at play here. Rather, it's the issue of whether projects are inordinately delayed or seriously scaled back. Or simply put, beware, the infrastructure bill is not all that it's cracked up to be. With that, I'll turn it over to Rob Miles, who'll review the infrastructure tool we developed. It's all yours, Rob.
Thanks, Rick. Before we go into the tool itself and outline some of the procedures and its uses, let's start with some background on the development of this Excel model. So the infrastructure investigation tool really builds on the lessons of our analysis into COVID-19 impacts. If you're familiar with those Excel tools, really all we're doing is identifying areas of impacts, defining connections around those impacts, and how they can magnify an impact on one industry in relation to other industries, and help to develop sort of a decision support procedure around those connections. The bottleneck research, identifying those risks at the industry level where there are certain factors that could potentially mitigate a boon from infrastructure spending, is our core impact statement. So instead of thinking about disruptions from COVID-19, we're thinking about potential bottlenecks at an industry level because of labor or different connections. And what we're doing here in the tool is applying that to this infrastructure process. The focus here is to allow clients to define their own priorities, right? So the traditional case, building on our COVID-19 research, is to allow for the connection between credit portfolio and industry risk factors. But any quantitative metric can be used, or the tool can simply just be a targeting system based on industries of interest. Then those connections are linked to the risk factors as defined by the bottlenecks. And a series of tables allow the user to move through connections between those risks and look up and down the supply chain. And the process in which a user flows through that information sets the stage as a guideline where our research methodology can act as a stepping stone for further research into these factors. So let's take a look at the general process. First, the client defines their priorities, right? They can either simply just be adding in, quantitative metrics from a credit portfolio, assigning state level indicators, or even just skipping this entirely and focusing directly on IBISWorld risks. The purpose of the tool is to connect these risk factors that we're talking about in terms of infrastructure with some form of priority on your end. From there, it's all about identifying key concentrations and building targets from there. Identifying an industry that's a core industry, looking at its feeders, seeing where there's connection, seeing where there's risks up and down the supply chain. Then you identify those targets and use those to find pain points and opportunities. Anywhere there's a risk, the flip side is always the potential for an opportunity. Now we can go through an example using screenshots from a sample of the tool. What we're using here is a constructed bank portfolio with a random assortment of exposures to different NAICS industries. The starting point here is to target a sector and then to look at the key exposures in that sector. In this case, we can see that in the construction sector, NAICS code 238210 is our largest direct exposure using the sample portfolio. In our nomenclature, this is a feeder industry, so it's one of the industries that feeds directly into a core infrastructure industry, one of those that is directly impacted by the spending bill. In our bottleneck risk exposure analysis, it's relatively low. It's below 5, so we consider it to be relatively low on the total scale. But if we look further into the industry, we can go upstream 1 degree in the supply chain, and we can look at all these wholesaling industries that sell into that construction industry. And we can see that while they don't have a ton of different types of risks, they do have relatively high supply chain risks. There's potential for disruption, a lot of price dynamics that can affect them. There's also a degree of additive exposure when you think about these industries and the relationship upstream when we look at the mapping of the overall portfolio. And that's one of the core concepts that we're looking at here is identifying where there are potential risks that are hidden from your target industry and where there are additive concentrations based on your quantitative inputs. And then from there, we can take it a step further and look at a little bit more detailed analysis of other potential factors that can affect that target industry. So what we have at the bottom right here is data from the BLS looking at the distribution of different types of occupations. In this case, we're looking at it just in the perspective of a southeastern footprint. As you might expect, there's a high degree of construction extraction occupations for a construction industry. But when you think about the region as a whole, the density of those occupations is relatively low compared to the US at large. So that presents a separate issue of if this industry is receiving funds and is trying to be built up, is there enough of key employee types to build out? It's just a food for thought and a place for extra research to go into an analysis of a specific industry. All right, your turn, Dev.
Thanks, Rob. So let's talk a little bit about contractors, construction contractors, and their vulnerability to the business cycle, and with that, the pandemic and related issues. Let's start first with sensitivity to interest rates. We now are aware that the Fed is going to raise interest rates, already has, but what does this really mean for contractors, particularly construction contractors? Well, for starters, as general rates rise, so do real estate cap rates. So what's the big deal? Well, a higher interest expense cuts into the net operating income off of income-producing properties, which means that, of course, the NOI is a little bit lower. Then that lower NOI is capitalized by a higher cap rate, and that results in a lower value. So, for example, let's suppose that you had $100,000 of annual net operating income and a 4% cap rate. So what you're really saying is that that's worth 25 times that $100,000. Unfortunately, if the NOI drops down to, say, 900 because of a higher interest expense and cap rates go up by 5, now you got $90,000 multiplied by 20. I think you get the point. The lower value means that when all of these many perm loans that are coming due for renewal, borrowers are going to be looking for a higher loan to value because their property has not appreciated in value. And then there's the highly vaunted accelerator principle. So you probably had this in Econ 101. A new capital investment comes in chunks. You don't build half of a 10-story office building or half of a $200,000 warehouse. What you do is you go ahead and build the office building and you build the warehouse, but it takes a little while to fill up the office building and lease it up. It takes a little while to fill up the warehouse. And that means that in terms of productivity, however you want to measure it, revenue or income per square foot, you're going to have a drop off in the value stream coming off of that, and so those higher interest rates are going to result in investors getting a little bit more wary. And that's no surprise that when interest rates start rising, investment in new infrastructure, new capital infrastructure, comes to a halt pretty quickly. And then, of course, there's the pandemic supply chain kinks that have been going on now for the last couple of years. You all have probably seen the rise and fall, the roller coaster rides in the prices of lumber. But, there are other material shortages out there. Cement, drywall, asphalt, and to some degree, drywall and asphalt, and of course, depend upon oil, directly or indirectly. And then there's the bouncing around that's been going on with metals, particularly steel, copper, and aluminum. Not to mention just the sheer difficulty of getting this stuff to the marketplace. Well, let's add to that the labor shortages, both in skilled and unskilled workers. So as you get that carpentry subcontractor in there to do the woodwork for your new homes that you're building, maybe he's way behind because of work he's been waiting for on other deals that he's got, and not to mention that the materials he needs to put in those cabinets is probably held up someplace. And then there's what I'll call the process issues. the shortages of appraisers with the background that you need. You don't want a residential appraiser appraising an office building. And then there's the time it takes to do a survey. Once again, it's a challenge of getting the people you need to get it done. There's the slowdown in the processing of governmental stuff, particularly building permits. Then there is that independent engineer who's brought in to check the progress. Contractor says that he's 50% complete. You bring in an engineer to assess that, an independent engineer or somebody hired by the lender. And that impacts the progress payments. And the progress payments are what the contractor needs to get in order to pay his subs, in order to pay for the materials and the labor. Then, of course, there's the governmental bureaucracy dealing with getting a notice of completion. And a notice of completion infers that everything that you need is there, but we've been reading in the papers of homes with garage doors still missing, windows not there yet. And when it comes to then, how do you deal with things like the contractor's final retention? You know, contractors have been running with a 20% gross profit margin for quite a while. Typical retention is 10%. So literally half of a contractor's gross profit comes in one check. And then, of course, the suppliers don't get paid. You've got to deal with material liens. A lot of pressure. And as I talk, I'll probably come to the end of this with credit considerations. Progress billings end up often being a form of collateral, but if the progress billings are not coming on time, it kind of makes them look weak. Line of credit financing for the contractor, if the contractor is not being able to progress and get the job done as he projected, then you've got cash flow issues there. And then, of course, the bonding availability. Big jobs are going to take more bonding, but what if the sureties get a little bit unsure or uncomfortable? All of these things come together to basically make it a challenge. So with that, back to you, Matt.
Okay, thanks, Dev. Really appreciate that. Just as we wrap things up here, just wanted to remind everyone that we will be sending the slides to this presentation out afterwards in a follow-up. It will be accompanied by that link to the blog post from Chris Nichols that we mentioned earlier, as well as that link to the National Association of Counties, which had a lot of the information that we use to publish some of this piece. We'll also be sending out that tool that Rick and Rob took us through that can help you understand some of the industries that are being impacted by the topics that we discussed. And any questions that were submitted to the chat box during the webinar will be followed up on via email after the fact. If you have anything that comes to mind once we've ended here, do not hesitate to reach out to your IBISWorld client relationship manager or submit an inquiry on our website. Myself and Rick, we're happy to answer any questions as well. We really hope that everything that we provided here today was insightful for those that attended, and we look forward to seeing everyone again soon. Thanks and take care.